Salutations and welcome to Amalfi Sports. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and today Amalfi Sports is giving you a breakdown of the 2021 NBA Finals matchup between your Eastern Conference champion Milwaukee Bucks and your Western Conference champion Phoenix Suns, which starts tonight, Tuesday, July 6th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on ABC ESPN. So make sure to tune in to check it out. And I want to say thank you, first of all, to all of those who tuned into the NBA playoffs preview. We did what feels like several months ago, but was about 6 weeks ago. The NBA playoffs always take a while. Me and Joey DePinto, who is my co-host for that, I think we got a fair amount of things correct, actually, if you go back and watch that. For starters, we both picked the Western Conference correctly. We both had the Phoenix Suns here in the finals. We also felt that injuries would really define the playoffs. And I think that no doubt about that it certainly has. But we were a little bit off when it came to the Eastern Conference. Didn't see the Bucks coming out of that. I'll be honest, I was unsure the Bucks were even going to make it out of the first round with their matchup against the Miami Heat, I should say. So kudos to the Bucks for making it through. And before we get into this year's finals and breaking down the X's and O's and breaking down the one-on-one matchups and the coaching advantages, etc., I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about just how we got here to some extent. And as I mentioned previously, a lot of injuries. This was really one of the defining features of this year's NBA playoffs. As we mentioned on the playoff preview, this was always going to be an issue because there was a very short layoff between the pandemic season and the start of this season. It was a very consolidated schedule, a lot of backs, and a lot of guys who were hurt throughout the regular season. For instance, the Brooklyn Nets, their big three of Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Kyrie Irving only played together 8 times in the regular season. Granted, Harden was a midseason acquisition, but still very little continuity there. We really saw that continue to play out in the playoffs. From the Nets, obviously, Harden and Irving both being injured, Harden really being out there on one leg the last couple of games of their series against Milwaukee. The Lakers with LeBron having questionable health coming in, Anthony Davis being hurt. The Sixers, we saw Joel Embiid playing on a torn meniscus. And while not perhaps a physical injury, we saw the mental collapse of Ben Simmons in that series against the Atlanta Hawks. And so physical and mental toll being taken in the playoffs. And listen, even the two teams that are here in the finals, the Bucks and the Suns, both have had to overcome significant injury issues. Obviously, the Bucks, much more concerning with Giannis, their two-time MVP, currently out, questionable for game one. Status for the entire finals is quite questionable, actually. So they were able to win the last 2 games of their series against the Hawks without him. On the Phoenix Suns side, Chris Paul with a nagging shoulder injury that you've seen really wear on him throughout the playoffs. You've seen him obviously be labored at times, and a lot of that athletic tape, a lot of that sports medicine tape that's on that shoulder, always trying to keep it, limber, always trying to keep it in shape. But you also saw Trae Young in the Eastern Conference Finals get hurt. You saw Kawhi get hurt for the Los Angeles Clippers. So again, the very best stars and the very best teams in the NBA were dealing with just a rash of injuries across this year's playoffs. So certainly probably not what Adam Silver and the NBA wants to see in terms of their best players, their biggest stars getting hurt. But certainly it's hard to ignore that as one of the defining attributes of this year's playoffs. The other thing I think that we mentioned in the NBA playoff preview that has certainly continued to come to light is a huge difference between the regular season and playoff basketball. Some teams were ready for that and some teams were not. Regular season, I think the best example of this is probably the New York Knicks, who were very scrappy and got to that 4 seed. Tom Thibodeau teams always are known for playing very, very hard, giving their all. He plays his starters a lot of minutes. He has a shorter rotation typically, very veteran focused. And that's a good way to rack up a decent regular season record and get into the playoffs. The problem is when everybody gets in the playoffs, everybody starts trying really hard. The NBA, it's one of those things where everybody's going at about 80%. And Tom Thibodeau teams are known for going 100%, going all out all the time. And again, in the regular season, you can rack up a lot of wins that way. You can steal a lot of wins that way to some extent. Get to the playoffs, you get exposed a little bit. Everybody's playing with that same level of intensity, and you just can't rely on intensity and trying hard to necessarily get you that victory. The other thing we saw was obviously coaching strategy. I think that really played out in the Sixers Hawks series. Ben Simmons' mental collapse notwithstanding, what you saw was Nate McMillan, who is now the permanent coach of the Atlanta Hawks. They took that interim title off of him on Sunday. And you saw Nate McMillan really outcoach Doc Rivers in a lot of ways. Doc Rivers, great regular season coach, obviously has an NBA championship with the Boston Celtics from 2008. But Doc's a guy who doesn't make a lot of adjustments. He goes with what got him there. He's the type of guy who doesn't tinker with his rotation very much. He doesn't tinker with his lineup all that often. And so again, when you get to the playoffs, it's about chess pieces. It's about moving players around. It's about making certain matchups not playable. It's about playing certain players off the floor because they're defensive or offensive liabilities. You didn't see Rivers make those adjustments quite as readily as somebody like McMillan did. So I think we saw, again, big difference between the regular season and the playoffs. Now, the other thing, and the positive, I think if you're the NBA and Adam Silver, is you did see the emergence of new stars. Listen, LeBron is LeBron. He's going to be starring in the next Space Jam movie that's coming out here in a few weeks. Great, good for him. So you are always going to have stars. You're going to have Kevin Durant. You're going to have James Harden. You're going to have Kyrie Irving. You're going to have those guys. Joel Embiid, Giannis. These are well-established stars, guys who are MVP or MVP candidates. But you also saw the emergence of guys like Trae Young for Atlanta, who really burst onto the national scene. A lot of people who follow basketball know Trae Young well, but your casual fan probably maybe remembers the name a little bit from his time in college and might have known a little bit about him for the Hawks. But, he really has emerged as this, I refer to him as kind of an Allen Iverson light. He's this little guy. He chucks up a ton of shots. The downside is, much like Iverson, he gets hurt because when you start going in and driving, you can start getting knocked down and getting hurt. You saw him dealing with shoulder and ankle injuries throughout the playoffs. So, he's a guy who emerged. Luka Doncic for the Mavs. Interestingly enough, those two players were traded for each other on draft night several years ago. And that was, a lot of people thought that Atlanta got fleeced basically by the Mavericks because Luka Doncic was by far and away the more refined prospect and the prospect with a much higher upside in everybody's eyes. Well, maybe not quite as much. I mean, I think Luka Doncic is still a better player than Trae Young, but that is a very, very narrow margin, and perhaps just in the eye of the beholder. You also saw with the Phoenix Suns the emergence of someone like Devin Booker. He's been great all season, and he's been really good on bad teams in Phoenix for a long time, even though he's a young kid. I mean, he came out after 1 year at Kentucky, so he's still a young guy, even though he's been in the league for several years. But again, he's a guy who probably has not gotten a lot of national notoriety playing on the West Coast. It's one of those things where, that is, the curse of, those 10 o'clock start times, 10:30 start times. People on the East Coast, people in the Central Time Zone, they're not staying up that late to watch your games out in Phoenix. So this is the first opportunity that most of the casual basketball public has of watching the Suns and watching this young man, Devin Booker, who is a scoring machine. I mean, he is a very dynamic scorer, very electric with the basketball in his hands, great shooter, can get to his spots. And so you see the emergence of a new generation of stars, and that's a good thing for the NBA because when you started seeing the LeBron generation, that's a little bit older. Even you start talking about guys like Durant, Harden. These guys are a little bit older now. Steph Curry, again, getting a little bit older. Klay Thompson. All these guys are, early 30s now. not everybody's going to be able to play into their mid to late 30s. Not everybody's LeBron. Not everybody's built like LeBron, whose body can take that sort of a punishment and that sort of a beating. So always have to be happy to see the emergence of some new stars. So enough of the general talk. Let's get down to the specifics and the path that both of these teams took to get to the NBA Finals. We'll start, of course, on the Eastern Conference with the Milwaukee Bucks, who in the first round got through the Miami Heat, then through the Brooklyn Nets, and then defeated the Atlanta Hawks in the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, a lot of people might put an asterisk next to their win over the Nets in particular. As I mentioned, Harden and Irving were both hurt for that series, but I'm not going to, and I'll tell you why. Those two have been hurt all season. It's one thing if Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Kyrie Irving had been healthy the entire season and had been healthy through the first round and a half of the playoffs. And then, oh my gosh, there's this catastrophic injury and these two guys are both out for multiple games or at a very limited capacity in one of those games. It's not true. These three guys never played together, hardly ever played together during the regular season, and injuries were a constant issue for them. So Milwaukee beat the team that the Nets were all season. The Nets were never a whole team. The Nets were never the big three. The Nets were 2 out of the 3, 2.5 out of the 3, sometimes just 1 out of the 3. The Nets were never this juggernaut of a team that everybody liked to talk about. On paper, they might have been, but the Bucks beat the team that was on the court all year, which was part of them. Part of the big three were on the court all year. And so to that respect, hey, the Bucks beat the Nets on their own terms. Like, that's who the Nets are. They are a team that was dealing with injuries throughout the year. And even with that was the number 2 seed in the Eastern Conference. And that's the team that the Bucks beat. So I don't put an asterisk next to them for that at all. Obviously, facing the Hawks in the finals was probably a surprising matchup, not one they planned. I think a lot of people expected for the Sixers to come out of that draw. Obviously, Ben Simmons' collapse, Embiid's injury, as well as, and not taking away anything away from the Hawks. Hawks did a phenomenal job in that series. Clint Capella, Trae Young, Kevin Huerter. You had a lot of really good players step up. Bogdanovic. You had Danilo Gallinari. You had a lot of really good players stepping up in that series and playing well for them. So kudos to the Hawks for making it as far as they did as a 5 seed. So the Bucks get here from the East through the West. You have the Suns, who in the first round ousted the defending NBA champion Los Angeles Lakers, then the Denver Nuggets, then the Los Angeles Clippers. So Phoenix pretty much owns the city of Los Angeles, at least for another year, having knocked out both of those teams in the playoffs. And did so, I think, in pretty impressive fashion and dispatched those teams very professionally. Granted, Chris Paul, who's the starting point guard for the Suns, very well-established pro, all-star many times over, great players, played on Team USA before in the Olympics. So great player, but has never made it to the finals. This is a guy who been in the league for a long time, finally now is in the finals. But with the exception of Paul, that is a young team. I mean, you talk about Devin Booker, DeAndre Ayton, Mikal Bridges, Jay Crowder's a veteran. But outside of that, you have a lot of young guys. Cameron Payne, as a bench player, Dario Saric. And these are still younger guys who don't have experience getting to the NBA Finals. And for them to be as professional as they were throughout this, I think really speaks to Monty Williams as a coach, also speaks to Chris Paul, getting this team to be as professional as they need to be when playing and ratcheting up that level of intensity for the playoffs. So we have Phoenix and Milwaukee, and I think one of the big questions that a lot of people are asking, and NBA Twitter is always a buzz with these types of things. NBA Twitter is by far and away the best sports league Twitter you can possibly find. It is incredibly petty. Guys are taking shots at each other constantly, and the people who cover the sport are incredibly entertaining to follow on social media. But one of the big questions on basketball Twitter is the NBA happy with this matchup? Phoenix, Milwaukee. From a rating standpoint, this is not New York and Los Angeles, right? I mean, I'm sure that David Silver was very hopeful that the Brooklyn Nets would come out of the East, that either the Lakers or the Clippers would come out of the West. Man, you'd have a New York LA final, get a lot of ratings from those two media markets. Now, to some extent, listen, the NBA finals, it's not the Super Bowl, but to some extent, it is ratings proof that there are just diehard NBA people who are going to watch no matter who the matchup is. And there are a lot of very compelling storylines in this matchup. The fact that it's two very different franchises being in the finals that are, traditionally never there, that's exciting. So there's a lot going on here with the Phoenix and Milwaukee matchup. But from a rating standpoint, from a metric standpoint, maybe not the matchup that the marketing people may have wanted, and maybe some of the sponsors are less than thrilled. Although I think you still have some bankable stars on these teams. But again, it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And certainly it'll be interesting to see how the ratings play out in this year's NBA Finals. So now let's actually get to the finals themselves and start breaking down this series a little bit. First, let's go back and look at the regular season. These two teams played each other twice, and in two incredibly entertaining games. The Suns won both games, but they were both 1-point games. One of them went to overtime. So two very evenly matched regular season matchups in this regard, which, hey, I mean, that spells for a great and potentially very entertaining NBA Finals based upon what they did in the regular season. Now, of course, the big question is the status of Giannis. And is Giannis going to be available for the Bucks from game one on? When is he going to become available? When he is available, will he be at 100%? Will he be the same sort of dynamic scorer that he can be, the same sort of slasher? Is he going to have the same level of athleticism coming back from that hyperextended knee injury that he suffered in game 5 of the Eastern Conference, game 4 of the Eastern Conference Finals? And so if Giannis is not at 100%, if he's not coming back, then that really does change the nature of this matchup quite significantly. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Credit to the Milwaukee Bucks, who promptly won the next two games. They lost the game that he got hurt in, but then went ahead, won the next two games to close out the Hawks. Granted, one of those games was without the Hawks star Trae Young, but still very impressive. Now, if Giannis can't go, then Bobby Portis is going to come from off the bench and start in his place. And that has a ripple effect for Milwaukee. So there's a lot of questions that start coming up after that. When you start to have to move Bobby Portis into your starting lineup, you lose a little bit of bench depth, and then you start worrying about your rotation, how many minutes these guys are playing, fatigue, etc. So we will see kind of how this all plays out. But let's look at things from the Bucks' perspective. And listen, I think this year we can say that Giannis is dealing with his own issues. We saw Ben Simmons deal with it, very publicly, not being able to hit free throws, being so timid to even take shots because he was worried about being fouled, because he lacked that sort of confidence. And so Giannis is not that bad. I mean, Giannis, to Scottie Pippen, made this point. Giannis doesn't mind airballing shots. He will airball free throws. And he's an atrocious free throw shooter. I mean, it's stunning to see this guy take 10, 12 seconds to shoot the free throw. And with the opposing team's fans are, counting off how many seconds, how many dribbles, that sort of thing before he actually takes a free throw. But he'll just airball these. The difference is Giannis comes down the next time on the court, drives right at the hoop, gets another foul, goes right back to the line. Airballs, maybe two more, does not care. And that's the sort of mentality that Simmons just simply doesn't have. And that's the difference between somebody like Giannis, who's a two-time MVP, and somebody like Simmons, who is a good player, an all-defensive player, but is not an MVP caliber player. So Giannis is a liability in some ways on offense. He also does get in the habit of shooting a lot of threes. He's not a great shooter. So the question is, when he comes back from injury, if he's not confident in that knee, is he settling for threes? Is he settling for contested jumpers? That's not his game. And that's an easy way for the Bucks to start really digging themselves a hole because Giannis is going to have a huge usage number. So he's going to be taking the ball. He's going to be using it a lot. And if he's putting up a 3 for 14 night, if he's putting up a 4 for 17 night, they're going to get down and they're going to get down fast. And that's a problem. The other thing you see is a lot of isolation for the Bucks. They tend to be a very ISO heavy team where they just kind of clear out. We've seen this a lot in the playoffs, especially with Giannis in particular. When he's not on the court, a little bit more team basketball, a little bit more pick and roll, a little bit more motion offense. So it'll be interesting to see if they still are as isolation heavy when Giannis is in there, given that he's probably not as dynamic coming off the hyperextended knee injury. The other issue that you have with the Bucks, and this is one that's been brought up, I think, a couple times throughout the playoffs, is metrics and analytics versus personnel. We all know in the modern NBA, you need to shoot threes. The problem is the Bucks are not built to shoot threes. The Bucks don't have a team that is, the 2016 Golden State Warriors. They are not built to shoot threes. Chris Middleton is an okay three-point shooter, not an elite three-point shooter, but an okay three-point shooter. Drew Holiday traditionally has not been, in the regular season, he was a pretty good three-point shooter, but Drew Holiday career is about a 29-30% three-point shooter and has returned to that form in the playoffs. Giannis, not a great three-point shooter. So you have their big stars, Chris Middleton, Giannis, and Drew Holiday. None of those guys are great three-point shooters. They're okay. There's, two of them are probably average to slightly above average, but nobody's an elite three-point shooter. You really have to look at guys like Jeff Teague or Bryn Forbes, who are coming off their bench, who are a little bit better and more well-established threes. But again, I know that what the numbers say is to shoot a lot of threes, but you got to look at your personnel. If your personnel is not really telling you to shoot threes, then guess what? You got to look a little bit more like the San Antonio Spurs and run a system where you're taking a lot of two-point jump shots, because that's where Chris Middleton is happy. That's where Drew Holiday is comfortable. And that's even where Giannis is more comfortable. It's inside the arc, Giannis driving, Middleton and Holiday getting to their spots around the elbow, 18 feet and in. They could be highly effective there. But if they just sit outside and just start bombing three-pointers, they're going to get killed. And so this is the question between the metrics, the analytics. This is how you need to play versus this is the personnel we have. And we'll have to see how that all plays out for the Bucks. Now, one of their big assets is Brook Lopez, their center. Huge asset in the Atlanta series. Played just phenomenal in the two games that Giannis was out on both ends of the court. Really dominated Clint Capella in their matchup. And so Lopez is a dominant center. Really, really good ball player. And that said, he's going to have his hands full this series with the Suns' young, dynamic center, DeAndre Ayton, on both ends of the floor. Ayton is a very good defensive player and a very skilled offensive player. So Lopez is not going to be able to take half of his time off. It's not as if he's going to have an easy matchup on defense and have to work for it on offense or vice versa. He's going to have to work for it on both ends. That's going to wear him down. One of the things is, especially if Giannis isn't playing and Bobby Portis is now in the starting lineup, Bobby Portis can take some of those minutes at the 5 spot, at the center spot. But if he's starting, then that really eats into their rotation and what they can do from a standpoint of throwing bodies at Ayton and trying to keep him defended. So that's going to be, PJ Tucker can probably take some of those minutes, maybe. He guarded Durant somewhat effectively as anybody does. So we'll see kind of what ends up happening there. But it'll be interesting to see how the Bucks end up dealing with Ayton. But Lopez, again, will present Ayton a challenge as well. It goes both ways. Like I said, Lopez is a very skilled player. Middleton and Drew Holiday, if Giannis is not able to play, those guys need to step up and they need to shoot. Both of them are shooting 10% worse from three this postseason, okay? Middleton is shooting 29%. I think Holiday's shooting 31%. They're both down almost 10 points from what their regular season numbers were. They need to step up. They need to hit their shots. They need to get to their spots. And like I said, it doesn't have to be hitting threes. If they hit those 15, 18-foot jumper shots, That's fine. But they need to get to where they need to get on the floor and get to their spots and hit those shots. And they need to feed Lopez and get some of those other guys involved in the series. So we'll see how that all continues to play out for the Bucks. For the Suns, listen, CP3, Chris Paul still has that shoulder injury. So how is that? Is that going to get agitated? Is it going to get aggravated? We'll see. Hopefully everybody can stay healthy this series, just for the sake of the quality of the series, quite frankly. Now, one of the questions that the Suns have, if Giannis is playing, who is going to guard Giannis? And I think that's depending on the type of player Giannis is when he comes back. That's a very interesting question, because in the starting lineup, if you look at it, you're going to have to put Ayton on, and Ayton doesn't, DeAndre Ayton doesn't have the skills to guard Giannis. Maybe in small numbers, but not over a prolonged stretch of time. And he's going to have his hands full with Lopez. Do you put Mikal Bridges on him? Bridges is 6'6", but he's only 205 pounds. Giannis is a physical guy, and so Bridges is very quick and a very, very skilled defender, very quick hands, for a young player, is a very, very smart defender. So he could pester him, but again, giving up a lot of size. The other option, Jay Crowder, also only 6'6", 6'7", but a little bit bigger, 235. Certainly if Giannis is trying to back somebody down, you want somebody like Crowder on him who gives him a little bit more resistance in all likelihood. So that's going to be a question of who's guarding Giannis. And again, what type of Giannis are we going to see? Are we going to see a guy who's shooting threes and settling for a lot of contested jumpers because he's not confident in that knee? Or is he confident in the knee? Is he coming on 100% and driving to the basket and drawing fouls and doing his thing? The other thing I'll say is the Suns, I mentioned the Bucks, their bench being a little bit limited now that Bobby Portis is in the starting lineup in place of Giannis. The Suns bench is also pretty limited. Torrey Craig and Cameron Payne are probably their two best bench players. And credit to both of them. They've been playing great this postseason. Shout out to Cameron Payne, who's a lefty. I also shoot left-handed, and so it's always weird to see people like that shoot on TV because you don't see a lot of left-handed shooters. But you see these guys who are they're playing very well, and they're shooting well above their regular season averages. So they're both having good seasons. But again, Torrey Craig, Cameron Payne, how many minutes are they going to be playing? Who are they going to be spelling? The other key guy I actually think in this series is going to be Dario Saric, coming off the bench for the Suns. And the reason for it is, with both, if Giannis is playing, then you have some really big lineups where you have Lopez and Giannis on the floor at the same time, potentially PJ Tucker, and you have a lot of size. And if you have that much size, the Suns really only have Ayton and Crowder. And then you have to have Sarge, who comes in at 6'10", 225. Now, the thing about Sarge is he's not athletic enough to stay in front of Giannis. And he's probably not big enough to really put up, consistently against Lopez. But he does have size. And Sarge does have some level of skill. I used to, when he played with the 76ers, I would follow him pretty intently there. He's a very skilled player, good passer. And he's become an average defender. He's just got slow feet. I mean, a lot of people, the expression that people use, he's the Croatian Larry Bird, in that he's not super athletic necessarily, but he knows he's just very basketball savvy. If nothing else, he can give you some minutes in big matchups, and he can expend those fouls. And again, depending on what Giannis is like, and if you want to start going to the hacky Giannis strategy, where you just start fouling him intentionally because he's 1 for 9 from the free throw line for the evening, and you just want to start putting him on the line so that you can start gaining possessions. We saw this with Ben Simmons. We saw this with Giannis. We see this with players. We saw this 20 years ago with Shaquille O'Neal. If you start hacking players who are bad free throw shooters, you need guys who can just use fouls. And Saric can be very, very helpful in that sense, in that he's a bigger guy, can match up, and he can also expend those fouls if necessary. So we'll be interested to see how that all plays out. The other question is, will Devin Booker continue his torrid stretch that he is on in these playoffs. This is a dynamic young superstar, and to see him perform, hopefully at the same level. He had an injury to his nose during the Western Conference Final, had a mask on for a couple of games, but the last game of the Western Conference Finals had that mask off. Seemed to be playing, didn't seem to inhibit him at all, and I think I'm just excited to see what Devin Booker is going to be able to bring to the table in this series. So should be just a great matchup. So with all of that said, who's got the advantage? I'm going to break it down. Starting five, bench, and coaching. Starting five, I like the Suns starting five. I just feel like they mesh really well. I like Ayton at the center. I love Chris Paul as a player. Booker is just such an elite scorer. I think he's a better elite scorer than Giannis is. And I think Chris Paul is a much more steadying influence and a much more consistent influence than someone like Drew Holiday or Chris Middleton. So I really like the Suns starting five. I even like them if Giannis is playing. Obviously, if Giannis is out of the lineup, then the Suns definitely have the advantage there. On the bench, honestly, it's probably in the eye of the beholder. A little bit of a wash. I mean, when you get this far, you're bringing maybe two guys off the bench, maybe three for a significant number of minutes. You're going to bring guys in maybe for a 2-minute run here, a 4-minute run here. But in terms of bench guys getting 15 to 25 minutes, really only maybe 2 or 3 for each team are going to get those sorts of minutes. Maybe a slight advantage to the Suns, only if Bobby Portis is thrust into that starting lineup for the Bucks. So we'll see. From a coaching standpoint, in my opinion, this is the biggest advantage. I just have an incredible amount of confidence in Monty Williams over Coach Bud for Milwaukee. And more importantly, I have more confidence in the combination of Monty Williams and Chris Paul than I do in Coach Bud and Drew Holiday, his point guard. I like Drew Holiday a lot. That's not a shot at Drew Holiday. I like him a lot. But with Chris Paul, you have a second coach on the floor, basically. And in this sort of a moment, I don't think you can emphasize this enough. And I know people will say, Matthew, Chris Paul's never been to an NBA Finals. Well, nobody on the Bucks has either. Well, actually, maybe PJ Tucker has years ago. But really, the Bucks are also a very inexperienced team when it gets to this level of the playoffs. So it's not as if, the Suns are going up against the Nets and guys who've been there before, or they're, they've dispatched very playoff savvy and very playoff experienced teams in the Lakers and the Clippers. And they're there standing there in the finals. So I really like Monty Williams and Chris Paul. So because of that, Cinderella run really for the Bucks. Proud of them, good for them, getting there. Great for the city of Milwaukee. Have a lot of friends from up in Wisconsin. I know they're super excited about it. But when you look at this series and break it down, I just don't see any way that the Suns don't win this series. I see the Suns winning in an easy 6 games. I think it could even be a gentleman's sweep. I think it could be a 5-game series. But I see this going to the Suns pretty easily in 6. And so that's my prediction. Suns in 6. And we'll see. Probably Bucks in 7 now that I said Suns in 6. But we'll see. But I'm excited about this NBA Finals. I think it'll be a great opportunity for the country to see a new group of players, a new group of superstars. And this is how the NBA continually renovates itself, continually reimages itself to bring new players like a Devin Booker, like a Chris Middleton to the public, who a lot of people may not be familiar with some of these names that are going to become household names over the next week or so. So remember to tune into the NBA Finals starting tonight, Tuesday, July 6th, 9 p.m. Eastern on ABC, ESPN. That's where you can catch all of the NBA Finals. And thank you for tuning in and subscribing to Amalfi Media. If you haven't already, do make sure to press that subscribe button on YouTube so you can get all of our great podcasts, our video content, and all of our sports content. We got horse racing, we have football, we have basketball, we have golf. We even have Nathan's hot dog eating contest videos. So we got something for everybody. So please do make an effort to press that subscribe button, check out what Amalfi has to offer. And until next time, I'm Matthew DeSantis saying so long and enjoy the NBA Finals.